Good afternoon. Good afternoon and welcome everyone. Can you hear me? It's not on again. It is on? No? Can you hear me? Great, okay. Good afternoon. Ms. Mara Bizotto, Chair of the Members of the European Parliament Delegation to Australia, Mr. Georgios Papatamkos, Vice Chair of the Delegation, Members of the European Delegation to Australia, Mr. Gabriel Mato Androva, Mr. Michael Kramer, Mr. Petru Konstantin Luhan, Mr. Emilio Menendez del Valle, Mr. Hanu Takula. Your Excellency, David Daly, Mr. Harry Jenkins, Your Excellencies, the ambassadors from the European embassies and commissions, distinguished guests from the Australian government, and friends from the Academy and the wider community. Good afternoon and welcome to the Australian National University's Centre for European Studies. I do apologise for the technical malfunction. Hopefully it will improve as the proceedings go. I'm Jacqueline Lowe, the Director of this Centre, and it is my great privilege to chair this public seminar to mark the 30th anniversary of the agreement between the European and Australian parliaments. We are gathered this afternoon on Ngunnawal land, and it is my great privilege to also be able to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land and to affirm the ANU's commitment to reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. We have a jam-packed program, so I won't hold you up any longer. Let me begin by introducing our first two speakers, who will present an introduction and an overview to the European-Australian Agreement. Our first presenter is Mr. Harry Jenkins, Speaker of the House of Representatives of the Australian Parliament. Mr. Jenkins is the longest-serving Labor member of the House of Representatives, and we're very lucky indeed to have him here today because, as you know, Parliament is sitting, and I've promised Mr. Jenkins's office that he will be back in Parliament House before 12:30. So you'll have to excuse him if, as soon as he finishes speaking, he's going to have to make his way out of this room. Mr. Jenkins will be followed by His Excellency, Mr. David Daly. Mr. Daly is the Ambassador and Head of the Delegation of the EU to Australia and New Zealand. Mr. Daly has worked in the external relations side of the EU service for almost 20 years and had previously served also in the Irish diplomatic service. So, without further ado, if I could invite Mr. Harry Jenkins to first take the podium. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Lowe. I very warmly welcome Ms. Mara Bizotto, Chair of the Delegation, and members of the European Parliament that are here this week in Australia. I also join with Jacqueline in greeting His Excellency David Daly, the Ambassador and Head of Delegation of the EU to Australia and New Zealand. I've informed him that I'm a bit upset that I'm opening the batting and I don't get to give him advice. He's assured me that he'll give me advice. But on a serious note, when I note that he is the Head of Delegation to the EU to Australia and New Zealand, regrettably, as we stand here today, there's been a further earthquake in Christchurch, and in a way our thoughts are with the New Zealand people as they try to combat yet another natural disaster. To my friends who appear to be gathered here in the front rows, ambassadors, I don't know what the collective noun for ambassadors is. Parliamentary parties, it's a caucus, but I'll think about an appropriate collective noun for my friends in the diplomatic corps, especially my friends from European countries who do such a great job on behalf of their countries. To the academic staff from ANU and beyond that are here, ladies and gentlemen, I join with Jacqueline in acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather and pay my respects to their elders past and present. It's my pleasure to make some introductory remarks at this seminar to mark the 30th anniversary of official interparliamentary meetings between the Australian and European parliaments. The first official interparliamentary exchange between the parliaments took place in 1981, with a visit to Australia by a delegation from the European Parliament. Since then, the annual parliamentary exchange of delegations has been a focus of relations between the two parliaments. European parliamentary delegations visit Australia one year, and Australian parliamentary delegations visit the European Parliament and institutions in the alternate year. I've had the opportunity to visit the European Parliament twice. My first visit was as a member of the parliamentary delegation in June 2000, and I visited again last month as Speaker. And can I say what a difference a decade makes? The profound change in my experience goes well beyond the expansion of Europe. It is obvious that through the Treaty of Lisbon and other treaties and structures that what is developing is now a new European Parliament. It is Europe doing things as Europeans. I saw evidence that as an institution the European Parliament has moved beyond nationalism. Understanding this evolution is very important for us as Australians, given our shared roles with Europe in the G20, the WTO, in our efforts to address global challenges such as climate change, non-proliferation and counter-terrorism. Another positive outcome of bilateral visits for the Australian Parliament is the fact that they have provided the catalyst for a wider focus on other European institutions and agencies. This has provided an opportunity for Australian parliamentarians to broaden their perspectives of Europe and through this international developments. One only needs to consider Australia's service as part of a NATO-led force to understand the significance of the opportunity of our formal relationship provides to us as parliamentarians. An important topic of formal discussions in forthcoming days will be a further development of relations between Australia and Europe. I am supportive of a treaty-level framework agreement as a mechanism to maintain the momentum in Australia-EU relations, although issues as the value add of a treaty versus our successful engagement under the Australian-EU partnership framework will no doubt be the subject of much deliberation by academics and commentators today and in the short term. Other proposals to be considered in the parliamentary context this week include video conferencing between parliamentarians, deepening contact between the staff of both parliaments, and through future high-level visits. And later this year we will welcome the Secretary-General of the European Parliament, including as it does contributions from two members of the European Parliament, Hanu Takula and Michael Kemer, and leading academics Professor Paul Pickering and Dr. John Besemeres. I'm sure today's seminar will be a valuable information exchange. I'm delighted today's seminar is being hosted by the ANU Centre for European Studies. The Centre is making a substantial contribution to Australia's understanding of Europe. I thank the Centre for hosting this seminar, which gives members of the European Parliament, academics, diplomats and the camera community the opportunity to discuss the relationships between Australia and Europe during this 30th anniversary of cooperation between our parliaments. Now I conclude with an apology for being unable to remain throughout the proceedings. In fact, today's parliamentary schedule has been brought forward and I actually got out of having to open proceedings at 12 o'clock to be here. But I will have to return to make sure that they might one day be behaved. But thank you very much and all the best.
Madam Director, Mr. Speaker, firstly, Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Harry Jenkins, Madam Director, Madam Bisotto, Head of the Delegation of the European Parliament to Australia, and fellow MEPs, the Honourable John Aquilino, Your Excellencies, professors, distinguished guests, I'm very honoured to give a short address at today's seminar. The visit of the delegation of the European Parliament to Australia is timely. As we see, it marks the 30th anniversary of the formal agreement between the European Parliament and the Federal Parliament of the Commonwealth of Australia. Relations between Australia and the European Union are long-standing and robust. And over the years, our relationship has evolved beyond the sometimes acrimonious debates over the common agriculture policy to one which is deeper and much broader. Today, we cooperate across a very wide range of political, economic, and sectoral issues, from security issues in the Pacific to the Doha round of trade liberalization and environmental issues such as climate change. Our relations are cemented in our Partnership Framework Agreement of 2008, which describes this cooperation in detail. Late last year, Prime Minister Julia Gillard, during her visit to Brussels, proposed that the Australia-EU relationship be upgraded politically through the negotiation of a treaty-level framework. This proposal was warmly welcomed by President Van Rompuy and President Barroso, and officials are now exploring what this might mean in detail. Europe is not the same place it was 50 years ago, and nor is the rest of the world. In a constantly changing, ever more interconnected world, Europe is grappling with new issues: globalization, democratic shifts, climate change, the need for sustainable energy resources, and new security threats. These are the challenges facing Europe in the 21st century, but they are also challenges facing Australia. We are working together in a strong dialogue in bodies such as the UN, the G20, most recently the Asia-Europe meeting, which Australia last year joined as a member, the so-called ASEM. We're working together on these issues. Over the last 10, 15, 18 years, the EU has gone through a long period of institutional reflection, analysing how the EU should organise itself for meeting these challenges. The resulting Lisbon Reform Treaty provides the EU with more streamlined institutions and better working methods, enabling an EU of 27 or more member states to tackle more efficiently and effectively today's challenges. In a rapidly changing world, Europeans look to the EU to address these global challenges, but to do so in a way which keeps the EU institutions in touch with its citizens. One of today's challenges concerns bringing the European Union closer to the 500 million citizens across the 27 member countries. The Lisbon Treaty reinforces democracy in the EU and its capacity to promote the interests of its citizens on a day-to-day basis. Over the years, the powers of the European Parliament have been progressively strengthened. Each revision of the treaties has seen an increase in the power of the Parliament in relation to the other institutions. But this is particularly so with the Lisbon Treaty. Today, the European Parliament is firmly established as a co-legislature. It has budgetary powers and it exercises democratic controls over European institutions. The Council and the Parliament together constitute the Union's budgetary authority, which each year decides on the EU's expenditure and revenue. The Parliament also has major supervisory powers over the activities of the European Union. For example, it has the power to censure the European Commission, and the appointment of the European Commission President and the College as a whole needs the endorsement of the European Parliament. Parliament plays an active legislative role which has an impact on the daily lives of its citizens across a wide range of areas: environmental protection, consumer rights, equal opportunities, transport, free movement of workers, capital, services, goods, to list just some. The Lisbon Treaty has made the European Parliament a co-legislator to the Council across the vast majority of areas through the extension of the previously called co-decision procedure. This represents a key shift in the balance of EU institutional powers. Parliament now has to agree to bilateral agreements between the European Union and third countries, such as Australia. Now, why should any of this matter to Australians? Well, perhaps they might be interested in knowing how their biggest economic partner in terms of trade and investment is evolving. Perhaps they might want to see how their like-minded partner on the global stage is doing, especially bearing in mind the EU's increasingly important role in the Middle East, with Iran, and so on. We only need to track the movements of the High Representative, Cathy Ashton, to see this. Perhaps Australians may wish to know how to deal more effectively with the European Union. With its increased powers, for example, the European Parliament becomes the focus of much more attention, both within Europe and beyond. Currently, we are negotiating bilateral agreements with Australia in areas such as aviation, passenger name records, crisis management operations, and so on, all of which will have to go before the European Parliament. So it is in this context that I very much welcome Madame Bizzotto and her colleagues to Australia to have this opportunity of exploring these issues and exchanging information in the interparliamentary group with the Australian Parliament. I'm sure that this will help strengthen the EU-Australia relationship. It is an important part of the jigsaw. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Your Excellency. The next section of the programme features our distinguished visitors from the European Parliament. Our first speaker is Mr. Hanu Takula from the Member State of Finland. Oh, okay, certainly. In that case, our first speaker from the European delegation is Mr. Michael Kramer from Germany, representing the group of the Greens European Free Alliance. Mr. Kramer serves on the Committee on Transport and Tourism. In addition to this membership on the European delegation to Australia, he's also a member of the delegation to the EU former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia's Joint Parliamentary Committee. And Mr. Kramer has agreed to take one question after his speech. So, Mr. Kramer, please.
Mr. Speaker, Mr. Ambassador, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for the invitation, and I will talk about the system of the European Parliament. Because before I was elected in 2004 into the European Parliament, I was for 15 years in the city-state parliament of Berlin, West Berlin. And what is the difference? I was often asked, is it now better or is it worse? I always said, those categories you can't accept, all is different. Why is it different? When I was in the city-state parliament of Berlin, by the way, for 20 months we have been in government, a red-green government in West Berlin. It was the most successful government I can imagine, because in this time the soccer club went in the first division and the wall came down. And all the success we had done, I wish the red-green coalition here in Australia as well. But why is it so? We have 784 members, 34 members in the European Parliament. They are elected in a proportional system. But some rules can't work. For example, you learned at school, one man, one vote, or one woman, one vote. That is not possible. If we have it in the European Parliament, then we have a parliament with more than 5,000 members, or we have only 7 or 8 countries of the 27 member states. So there is a minimum for each country, and then the the number of the inhabitants will count. 784 members, and they came originally from more than 200 parties. But we have only 7 groups in the European Parliament. Nearly, it is not possible to work, but it is possible. But what is the difference? For example, the line width, the obligation to vote with your group. In the constitution in Germany, it is forbidden, but the reality you all know, the line width doesn't exist. And it can't exist. For example, if I look at the Socialist Party, Socialists and Social Democrats, there are, from France, the Socialists are very proud of their 60 nuclear power stations. And the German Social Democrats are very proud that they phased out on nuclear energy with the Greens. So they never can make a common position on energy. If I look at the Liberals, for example, from the United Kingdom are relatively green. Not as green as the Greens, but they are relatively green. And they are together with the Liberals of Germany. They perhaps just have learned how to spell environment. So they can't do it together. And if I look at the Greens, we have the Swedish Greens. In their constitution, they have they want to go out of the European Union. And that was a big debate there. And 2 years ago, they made a referendum. And the party members have decided with 55% to 45% to cancel this sentence. But we never could have a common position on Lisbon Treaty or other things because the differences are so big. Then one other rule you learned at school is not in power in the European Parliament. You learned at school the first power is the Parliament, the second one is the government, and the third one is the court. In the European Parliament, there are 3 institutions: the Parliament, the Commission, and the Council. The Council, the head of states. And only if the three institutions are in common, then we have a European law. So to look for a compromise, that is our daily task. And in the normal parliament, you have the game between opposition and government, and of course, the opposition is attacking the government and the groups of the government are defending the government. That is, with us, very different. But there's an advantage. The Green Group is relatively very small in the European Parliament, but the influence can be very big. I will give you an example. The Commission has the initiative, and only the Commission has the initiative. We as Parliament can't make an initiative. In every Parliament, you need to convince your group, then you make an initiative, and if you are in opposition, in 99%, you will not have a majority, and okay. But in the European Parliament, only the Commission can make an initiative. Then there is a rapporteur of a group, and the first act of the rapporteur is to come that the shadow rapporteurs of the other groups come together, and then they ask, okay, what do we want, we as Parliament? And then the differences of the party will be the end, not the beginning. And for example, when the Commission and the Council wanted to have passenger rights for trips on the rail, if the train is 1 hour too late, you will get 25% back of the ticket price. If it is 2 hours, you will get back 50%. Then the Commission and the Council wanted this regulation only for international trips. That means if I go from Cologne to Brussels, the train stops at Aachen, then at Lüttich or Liège, and then at Brussels. If you are in the train altogether, and you are only going from Cologne to Aachen, and the train is 2 hours late, you will get nothing. If you go from Aachen to Liège to Lüttich, because you are crossing the border, you will get 50% back. And if you go from Liège to Brussels, because it is not international, you will get nothing. And so we said, all the groups, that is crazy. We don't accept. Then we have to fight with the council and with the commission till 3 o'clock in the morning, and then we have found a compromise. This regulation is for all the trains, for all long-distance trains in Europe. And we have excluded the local trains. That was a fine compromise, and so I'm talking to the people in Germany or in Great Britain or elsewhere. If next week the train is 2 hours late, and you will get 50% of your money back, think of it, we have done this. Yeah? We are far away in Brussels, but we are very close to the people. Another issue, and then I will conclude, another issue is we had the discussion in the passenger rights to take your bicycle on the train. Also in the high-speed trains. The Germans have been against it, and I, as a Green, have fought for it. And in the first reading, I get a majority. Then it was complicated, and I never had a majority for it. Then I discussed, okay, we don't need to take your bicycle, we need an area in the train for sporting equipment, for big luggage, for strollers, and so on. And then, because I mentioned skiing, for example, the Austrian conservative came to me and said, oh, that is very interesting. Because in Austria, skiing is very important, economically important. Oh, fine. Then there was Belgium, and Belgium is divided, since 100 years in one state, but the Flemish people in Belgium, they ride their bicycle as often the Netherlands do, and the Wallonish people, they do it not very often like the French do. But the Flemish said, okay, we will make this amendment. And then there was an amendment of the Greens, of the Conservatives, and the Socialist Party. And then we get a majority. And so you can see, you can convince the others. Also, you are a small group, but the power is the argument. And therefore, I can tell you in the European Parliament, never before I was so free as a deputy, and therefore it is a great fun to work there. Thank you very much.
Mr. Kramer's agreed to take one question from the floor.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Anyone? Yes, please.
The student should ask.
I belong to the biggest political group in the European Parliament, the European People's Party. Me and Petro and Gabriel Mato, etc. Yes. And the majority is evident. Yes. Yes. One question. You come from Germany. I've got my PhD in Germany in European law. And my question, taking into account the checks, institutional checks and balances. Yes, in the European Parliament, according to the seats are divided according to the population of each country. Are you in favor of one state, one vote in the council as German to give content in the checks and balances in the European Union? Thank you.
Yeah, I'm in favor of one vote, one country, but we have now after the in the council, but we. Yeah, wait a minute. Wait a minute, please. But we have a majority system after the Lisbon Treaty. And I'm in favor of a majority system, but in the council there can be one man, one country, one vote.
Okay. I can see that this is already eliciting a lot of conversation, but because we've got a tight program, I do apologize we can't invite more comments. Perhaps after the speakers have finished, we might be able to return to this topic. Thank you.
Okay,
Thank you very much, Mr. Kramer. Our second speaker from the delegation is Mr. Hanu Takula from the member state of Finland, and he represents the group of the Alliance of Liberals and Democrats for Europe. Mr. Takula serves on the Committee on Culture and Education, and in addition to his membership to this delegation, he's also a member of the Delegation for Relations to Israel and with the delegation to the Parliament Assembly for the Union for the Mediterranean. Mr. Takula will likewise take one question after his speech, please.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, first of all, I said that it's good to be here. I feel very familiar because the boys, they already started the political debate, but the main reason why we are here that it's good to celebrate together the 13th anniversary of the parliamentary relationship between the Australian Parliament and European Parliament. But we are all aware that bilateral relationship between the Australia and the EU member states go back a lot further than that. I was very pleased to hear that you are keen to learn about issues relating to education in Europe. Education rarely dominates the conversations when it comes to European politics. I'm sure that in the past several months, the headlines in Australian or the Age or the Sydney Morning Herald have been mostly about saving the euro. However, I'm a firm believer that education is worth discussing not only here today, but more so even at the EU level. The challenge for my colleagues and I who are passionate about education is how to help improve the quality of learning system across Europe, to teacher quality, for example, given the fact that each EU member state decides on its own educational policy. To be precise, the EU influences education matters only through what is called the open method of coordination. But I would like to say that, as you know, that the new EU 2020 strategy, smart, sustainable, inclusive growth, in this strategy we have some targets that relate to education, and they are that 75% people aged between 2064 are employed, 3% of the EU GDP is invested in R&D, the rate of early school leavers is under 10%, and at least 40% of the younger generation has a tertiary education degree. But these are recommendations, not binding.
But community matter.
Yeah. I do not believe that EU should have legislative power in educational matters, but having worked in this area several years, I see massive untapped and hidden potential across Europe. PISA and OECD studies shows that standards in education vary enormously around the world, but large gap also exists between EU countries, and this is worrying. It is obvious that increased collaboration in educational matters in long term will have an impact on growth, jobs, and eventually Europe's competitiveness. There have been some very successful EU initiatives, some of which even Australian students have no doubt benefited from. For instance, the EU has been active in adopting priorities of the Bologna process, which works towards greater coherence in university-level studies and the creation of the European higher education area. Students, graduates, and higher education staff of today will find it much easier to move across countries and as their degrees are better understood. However, when it comes to higher education, Europe has much room for improvement. This is an area that we can learn more from Australia. Europe has around 4,000 higher education institutions with over 90 million students and 1.5 million staff. Some European universities are among the best in the world, but overall potential is not being fully realized. I was reading the Australian background brief on the plane and I was amazed again at how big a role international students play in Australian universities. the numbers are impressive, whether one looks at overall numbers of the overseas students or how much they contribute to universities' finances or the economy. The number of the students coming into the Europe to read full degrees is still relatively low. I have tried to doing my part in helping Australia. My son studied in New South Wales, so I would encourage all of you send your children to study in Europe. So I have some applications forms in my bag, so please talk me afterwards. And of course, I'm also very proud of that my former assistant, who worked with me about 1.5 years in Brussels, he is nowadays the PhD students here at the ANU. So I think that I have done what I can do. But anyway, so in Europe, his name is William Sanoman, and William is now here. I hope so. That yeah, he was here. In Europe, we have launched initiatives to raise the profile of Europe as a study destination. As you know, here in Australia, for example, EU has co-founded 3 EU centres which try to stimulate great interest in EU issues, and this place is one of that. I think that it's very important to promote Europe as a study destination, that people make the people aware that what European Union can offer to them. Of course, as you know, in Europe we have the very rich cultural heritage, and this is also the good reason to come to Europe. It is perhaps unavoidable that higher education gets more attention in international meetings, but we must remember that the foundation for learning are built much earlier. It is schools in the area of basic education where our children learn the basic knowledge, skills and competence that they need throughout their lives, and the place where fundamental attitudes and values develop. Schools and teachers in particular set their pupils on the path of the lifelong learning. While there has been much technological advancement and innovations in education, I nevertheless believe that a larger part of the future education will still be played in classroom by teachers. So I would like to underline the importance of the early years of learning and the role of the teachers. A Singaporean professor by the name Hiron Saleh identified the following chain, which to me crystallizes the values of the teachers. First, the quality of the economy is dependent on the quality of the human resources. Secondly, the quality of the human resources is dependent on the quality of education. The quality of education is dependent on quality of teaching and learning. Well, the quality of teaching and learning is dependent on the quality of teachers. And finally, the quality of the teachers is dependent on the quality of the teacher education. So I believe that investing in teachers is still perhaps the fastest way to improve results in education. In Finland, over the years, we have done exceptionally well in this area. Teaching has been a respected profession, and all teachers must have a master degree. Even nowadays, it's among the 3 most famous profession, the teacher's profession, and it's quite well paid in Finland also. And as you may know that those OECD PISA research, what I mentioned before, the result shows that Finland and Australia are the leading countries in terms of the teaching and learning outcomes. I have to say that because I'm from Finland, so I hope that my colleagues can accept that. But however, much of Finland's success is due to political decisions made 10, 20 and 30 years ago. Many European countries, Finland including, have not, in my opinion, taken this topic seriously enough in recent times. Budgets in education have actually been cut. Education, as well as research, is about making investment into the future. We must keep in mind that political visions too must always go beyond election cycles. When we look into the future, it becomes obvious that it is not natural or technological resources that are most important things in life. It is rather our children and youth that we must consider. The future of mankind relies totally on our children and youth, on their skills, knowledge, and capacity to innovate and learn. I would like to underline that our children are most valuable resources what we have in our society. All of them. That's very important to remember. And even though that I have underlined the importance of education in my speech, I would like to emphasize that even more than that, the purpose of the human life is not just to raise the GDP, but to be of value in itself. And education is just a tool to facilitate a better life. So I would like to thank you, your patience, and I'm happy to take some questions now or later if you have.
Question or comment, please? Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Only 2 minutes. You know that one of the golden rules of these missions, European missions which go abroad, is to avoid any kind of discussion among ourselves. Here, it doesn't happen anything at all. It has been only a little skirmish, nothing else. But I'd like to take advantage of the opportunity to say to you in 3 lines something which I am sure we all share. Not only my colleague from Spain, I am also from Spain, I'm a socialist, he is a conservative, but all of us, I think. First comment, this is going to be very lovely to our Irish ambassador. You remember that Mr. Bertie Ahern, your ex-prime minister, in 2004, when the new 10 countries, European countries, came to Europe, he said this, and I'm quoting by heart, you know, but he said, we should never forget, speaking about Europe, we should never forget that out of war, we have made peace in Europe. Out of hate, respect. We have transformed dictatorships into democracies and poverty into prosperity. Are you agree? We all are agree? Yes, I think. And finally, my concept of Europe is one which has civilian power as the most important characteristic of that. I think that, you know, we are a civilian power that implies the evolution of a distinctive character in the international affairs scene, which emphasizes diplomatic rather than coercive instruments, the centrality of mediation in conflict resolutions, the importance of long-term economic solutions to political problems, and I think that all these are characteristics which distinguish us from the great powers. This is very cheer to our president, Mara Bizzotto, as Tommaso Padua Scioppa said, one of the founding fathers of the community, La Forza Gentile. This is Europe. I bet that you all agree about what I said here. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, all we agreed what our colleagues have said, but if there's some question, I'm ready to
When we talk about the education in European countries,
Yeah, that's very good comment, and of course we try to promote the European Union, and I know that you have the long relationship between the UK, for example, here in Australia, and mainly when we talk about Europe, it means the UK for many of people who live here. But as I said, I encourage the people come to Europe, and there are many kind of good universities. Even in Finland, you can find some good universities. But I think it's very important that because we have the same values, you know, the Western values and the European values, which are nowadays the international values. When I see my friend from Greek, I have to say that our values is the Judeo-Christian values, and then Hellenic heritage and Roman justice. So we have to keep our values, and I think that we have to do more cooperation in the educational level also. One thing what I just would like to add, because as you know, the lifelong learning is a very hot topic in Europe, and it's also here. And it's not a long time ago when I find out that kind of slide, which shows me something what had happened during the years. UNESCO made some research concerning lifelong learning in the 1960s, and they emphasize on culture, learning, personal growth, humanistic ideals, human being, and life situation. Okay, and now European Union make this similar research, and okay, when UNESCO emphasize on culture, European Union emphasize competitiveness, and when UNESCO emphasize on learning, now European Union 2000 training, and when UNESCO emphasize on personal growth, now it's employability, and then UNESCO in the 60s they emphasize on humanistic ideals, and now economic rationale, and human beings, now it's active citizenship, and life situation, now it's labor market. And I'm a bit worried about that. It seems to me that, you know, we are very much market driven. How to say, I'm not a native speaker, I hope that is understandable what I said. And that's the reason why I said that I would like to underline that the purpose of the human life is not only to rise to GDP, but there's something else also.
It's kind of association of European Union.
Yeah.
Association.
Yeah, but I think that it's not only the European Union. Might be in Australia you have the same phenomenon in the global world. But anyway, thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. I'm very much hoping that these conversations will continue after the formal proceedings for this afternoon. But now we get to the final section of the program, and I call upon my colleagues from the Australian National University to provide some brief responses and reflections. First up is Professor Paul Pickering, an eminent historian at the university, acting director of the Research School of Humanities and the Arts, and the immediate past director of this centre. Professor Pickering will be followed by Dr. John Besemeres, visiting fellow of this centre and a specialist in Eastern European history and politics. Professor Pickering.
Members of Parliament, Excellencies, distinguished guests, colleagues and friends. On the occasion of the 30th anniversary of interparliamentary meetings between the Commonwealth Parliament and the European Parliament, I'm very grateful for the opportunity to comment on these institutions, their similarities and differences, and the significance of the relationship that has developed between them through these meetings. As time is pressing, you'll forgive me if my comments are perfunctory. The EU is undoubtedly one of the most important, arguably the most important institution to emerge since the Second World War. It is certainly unique. The Union is a profoundly important force for peace, security and democracy in Europe and beyond. Moreover, the application of the Copenhagen criteria to prospective members of the Union has undoubtedly helped to spread democracy and human rights in Europe. As an international actor, the EU is one of the world's most important promoters and guarantors of democracy, but it is not yet itself a democracy. I promised myself I'd avoid academic jargon, but I hope you will forgive me one exception. The EU is what scholars have called a demoiocracy. Demoi is the plural of demos, the Greek word for the people. A demoiocracy is a union of sovereign states that involves a horizontal transfer of sovereignty. The EU is a hybrid demoiocracy in that it is neither a union of democracies nor is itself a democracy. Thus, there is undoubtedly what political scientists call a democratic deficit in Europe. Some of those who exercise power over the lives of European citizens are not elected and not wholly subject to the will of those who are. Moreover, the level of democracy among the 27 member states varies considerably. If you look at the Economist's latest democracy ranking, you can see that the EU includes a number of states among the highest ranked full democracies, including Sweden, which is the world's most democratic state. But it also... I knew I'd get that response, Excellency. But it also includes a number of those ranked well down the list and regarded as flawed democracies. Interestingly, the European Parliament itself is not ranked at all in the Economist's ranking. And in some respects, and regrettably, I think, outside Europe, the EU is one of the modern world's best-kept secrets. However, the democratic deficit in Europe is not institutionalised. Observers might look bewilderingly at the complex way in which the European Constitution has evolved, but the point is that it has evolved. Moreover, the result of this evolution is that the EU is inexorably becoming more democratic. The Lisbon Treaty is a significant step forward in this regard. The extended arrangements for co-decision are complex, but the trajectory is clear. An ever-increasing role for those directly elected by the people to govern on behalf of the people. Now, as members of the European Parliament, you are the torchbearers and the guardians of this path to a truly democratic Europe. Australia is, of course, regarded as one of the world's oldest and most successful democracies. And indeed, it could be argued that with 3 levels of government and a high ratio of politicians to people, our democracy is a bit overdetermined. The origins of our democratic institutions are European and, of course, British in particular. Evidence of this is all around us. When you drive from the ANU to Parliament, for example, you might go along Langton Crescent, which was named to honour Archbishop Stephen Langton, who was one of those men, and they all were men, who forced King John to sign the Magna Carta in 1215. On permanent public display in the Parliament, there is an inspection issue of the Magna Carta published in 1297 that was purchased for Australia by Prime Minister Menzies in 1952. Now, of course, the Magna Carta did not make England a democracy, but by forcing a king who had to that point derived authority from God into a compact with at least some of the people, it was a step along the road to the notion that sovereignty resides in the people. Despite Australia's deep roots in the history of democracy, it is wrong to say that Australia's democracy is not without its problems and flaws. The Senate, for example, is not a democratic institution in the strictest sense of the word. Our founding fathers, and they were all men, determined that the Senate should be a states' house, with each state given equal representation. This produces our own democratic deficit. The votes of citizens in the larger states are worth far less than those in the smaller states. At the last election, for example, 4.3 million electors in New South Wales elected the same number of senators as the 360,000 electors in Tasmania. In other words, and I think my mathematics is correct here, Tasmania's votes are worth 12.7 times more than citizens' votes in New South Wales. Moreover, unlike Europe, the Constitution of the Commonwealth of Australia is stuck in the past. The mechanism for amending the Constitution by referendum adopted by the Founding Fathers makes it very difficult to change. A majority of citizens is not enough. It also requires a majority in a majority of states. Again, this gives electors in the smaller states far more say in the process than the populous states. As a consequence, since Federation, only 8 of 43 referenda have been successful. One of them, ironically, to guarantee democracy at local government level in the Constitution. I beg your pardon. I'm worried about time. Prior to a change in 1977, residents in the Australian Capital Territory and the Northern Territory did not vote in referendums. Since 1977 we have had a vote, but our votes are only counted towards the national total and not against the total in any states. Residents of Canberra in particular, ironically given the building up on the hill, have a fraught relationship with democracy. For many years, Territorians had no vote in the House of Representatives at all. In 1978, we voted no to self-government, but it was nevertheless introduced without a vote. The challenges faced by both Europe and Australia in nurturing and guarding democracy underscore the importance of these interparliamentary meetings, precisely because democracy is not about executive government. It is about sovereignty of the people. In both the European Union and Australia, the will of the people resides in parliamentary institutions. Now is not the time to canvass theories of representation, but it's important to emphasise that the role of members of parliament does not end when they endorse an executive. MEPs, members and senators share an important duty to protect and promote their relevance in a democracy. Now, I'm not sure if I have a theory here, but I certainly have an opinion. And that is ensuring that the needs of ordinary constituents are attended to is just as much of a service to democracy as an eloquent speech to a half-empty chamber. Remember that the greatest orator in the House of Commons in the late 18th century, the Irishman Edmund Burke, from whom we derive our modern concept of representation, was known as Dinner Bell Burke. That is, when he got to his feet to speak, all the Tories went to dinner. Beyond the fact that you share a common mission and common responsibilities, perhaps most importantly, the interparliamentary meetings present a vital opportunity for information exchange. Historians often refer to the tyranny of distance that separated Australia from its European roots. Despite the fact that we live in the age of Google and Twitter, for most Australians, Europe is still a long way away. When we think of and read about Europe in the press, we think of nation-states rather than pan-Europe institutions. Few Australians understand that Europe is now a superpower as important to the global future as the United States or China. But it is not all one way. In Europe, Australia features little in popular consciousness other than for our natural disasters, our shark attacks and our sporting prowess. On both sides, the severe limits in mutual knowledge are amazing given the high level of social, cultural and economic exchange between Australia and Europe. It is amazing given that we are bound together not only by history but also by shared values. And I've heard David Daly make this point on numerous occasions, and it is a point worth making. It is thus important for members, senators and members of the European Parliament not only to talk to each other but to share this dialogue by talking to your colleagues and to your constituents about the importance of our relationship. With the greatest respect, if it seems that I'm asking a lot of you, I am. Thank you.
And finally, John Besemeres, who's visiting fellow at the Centre for European Studies, and as I said, a specialist in Eastern European politics and history. John, please.
Thank you very much, Jackie. Distinguished visitors, colleagues and friends. Paul said a lot that I had in mind to say myself and said it better than I would have done, and he said a lot more besides. But one thing that particularly struck me in what he said was his reference to Edmund Burke as Dinner Bell Burke. I stand before you as Lunch Bell Besemeres. I note that it's already well past the time for lunch. I can almost hear your stomachs rumbling. I feel for you. I feel for you as one who feels the same way. I think it's probably time for lunch, unless, Jackie, you want to give me a 3-minute stay of execution? Okay. I was going to tell you a little bit about what we do in the centre, that's to say the academic community grouped around the centre. I should emphasise to our visitors most of them, are not on your payroll, but they're here for the love of it. They're here because they're Europhiles, and that means that they criticise Europe uphill and down dale on a daily basis. But nonetheless, they are Europhiles. And I think, in fact, in Australia, there are still a lot of Europhiles. Now, our visitors may not have noticed that all that much because they've probably already heard a good deal about the evils of the common agricultural policy and about perhaps also, given recently the remarks by Chancellor Merkel and Prime Minister Cameron about the failure of multiculturalism allegedly in their respective societies, you may have also been hearing how our model of multiculturalism is ever so much better than yours. And you may not see a lot of Europhilia in that. But Australia is still a very European society. And if I could just perhaps share a few light-hearted reflections on this theme with you before we're all herded out to lunch. Even I think the changes brought about by massive immigration after the war, firstly European mainly immigration and latterly Asian immigration, have not really much reduced the Europeanness of Australian society. I think many of the Asians, for example, who came, the Europeans were obviously Europeans, the Asians who came here, I think were often coming here in order to find a kind of European society distant from Europe, in the same sense that the United States is in many ways a European society, so is Australia, and it remains so. Many of those Asian people who came to Australia also were quite fluent or entirely fluent in English when they arrived. So Europeanism is alive and well in Australia, and I think in general Europeanness is something these days which has become perhaps more a cultural than an ethnic phenomenon. It's not stretching language too far to say that Japanese, Chinese or Indians can be exemplary Europeans as well as Japanese, Chinese and Indians. Australian intellectuals have often debated as to whether or not they should consciously strive to become Asians. This may seem to our visitors a slightly bizarre discussion, but it has raged in the pages of our press in the past, and no doubt will do so again. Should Australians, if they want to become Asians, make a conscious choice between Europe and Asia, between their past and their future, or between their cultural identity and their economic and strategic circumstances? Former Prime Minister John Howard once argued that they did not have to choose between their history and their geography, as he put it. But other people, many other intellectuals, and including prime ministers, have disagreed with him. And one such was Paul Keating, Prime Minister from 1991 to 1996, a man with a gift for the colourful phrase. Paul Keating was very, very strong in pushing the Asian identity in Australia, and yet Keating himself was one of the most passionate Europhiles of all in his personal interests, keenly interested in particular in European music and architecture. Keating was happy to lecture his European counterparts on the subject when he visited your countries, and he reportedly even once said, I'm not sure, with Keating he was such a coiner of magnificent phrases that he's often probably misquoted, but he has been reported as having said that Asia was the part of the world you travel over to get to Europe. And yet this was the Prime Minister who was pushing an Asian identity on us all. And according to his predecessor as Prime Minister, Bob Hawke, he even allegedly once said that Australia was the rear end of the world. Now, some of you here will detect that I've translated the original term, which wasn't suitable for polite company like the present. Keating's launch of Australia as an Asian country encountered some difficulties. Some of you may remember, particularly after he once publicly referred to the then Malaysian Prime Minister Mahathir as a recalcitrant, and then refused to apologise when an apology was demanded. But clearly Keating was onto an idea whose, in a sense, whose time had come in this country. Despite occasional discouragement from Asian leaders, notably Mahathir, the Keating era unleashed for a time in Australia a kind of Asia, I'd call it an Asiaphoria, a sense that when we stopped to think about it, like I think the Molière character we'd been talking prose, we'd been Asians all along, we hadn't fully realised it. Now we realised it, we also realised that we were experts on the subject. It seemed to many Australians that our mere proximity was enough to make us experts on Asia, but a lot of hard work needs to be done. And it is in fact being done in this country, and it's being greatly assisted by the big inflow of Asian migrants to this country. Nonetheless, Australians who are far away from everything else, even Asia, it's a long way to the nearest Asian country, are exaggerated versions in a sense of the Anglo-Saxon traveller in the 19th century who regarded everything beyond Dover as being rather suspect. They are a little bit insular, and perhaps more so than other Anglo-Saxons. All Anglo-Saxons, I know, we have this tendency. Australians are particularly prone that way. But for Australia to engage, whether with Asia or Europe, it needs to know its partners' languages, histories and cultures. And we're not probably doing quite enough. I'm just trying to curtail my remarks. I can see hunger is growing among you. We're probably not doing enough. There have been countless reports prepared on how to develop language training in Australia, and they've come up with very worthy recommendations, and yet years on, our language skills are not advancing. I can remember years ago reading about an Australian delegation, trade delegation, that had gone to Germany, which was then, until very recently, the leading trading country in the world. And they'd come back with disappointing results, and they were asking themselves why that was. And in the course of a review into the subject, they realised that they hadn't taken a single competent German speaker in their delegation. Now, this, I think, this anecdote illustrates the problem. Just in conclusion, I'd say that we here at the Centre for European Studies, on our budget, modest budgets, which people like myself are not burdening too greatly, are trying to dedicate ourselves to advancing the relationship between you and us, and to, in that direction, to strengthen European area studies and European language studies in Australia to the best of our ability. Thank you for your support.
Well, friends, I'm afraid time is against us, and I know many of you have to return to offices and to classes, but if you're able to, do please join us for a light lunch and more conversations and the development of some of the dialogue that has already emerged in the last hour. But before you do that, could you please put your hands together to thank our wonderful speakers for a most informative and stimulating hour of discussions. Special thanks to His Excellency Mr. Daly, John Besemeres, Professor Paul Pickering, Mr. Takula and Mr. Kramer. And thank you all for your attention.